We have the pleasure and the honor to have a discussion with Professor Ian Brown from University of Alabama. Professor Ian Brown is a professor of prehistory and ethnohistory for North America. He is also the chair of the Department of Anthropology here in the University of Alabama and former president of Southeastern Archaeological Conference and Association for Gravestone Studies. It is an honor for us to have him as our guest, even though we are guests at the University of Alabama. Because Professor Ian Brown has done pioneer works regarding the exploitation of salt sources in America, in eastern part of America, and his researchers and his work has been a model for our researchers. So it will be fascinating if Professor Ian Brown could tell us more about his research.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for visiting. Thank you for coming here and making the effort to see what we have in our country. I appreciate it very much. My interests are very eclectic. Most of my work has been on dealing with North American Indians, dealing with primarily the prehistory and the history of Eastern United States Indians primarily. I got interested in salt as an undergraduate, and I was telling you before about reading accounts of the early Spanish explorers in the southeastern United States, of the Hernando de Soto expedition. And when they were traveling through the area, they were so starved for salt that when they finally got it, they ate a little bit too much of it and didn't have a very good experience. But what I was curious about as an undergraduate was why I did not know this part of the story in terms of the Indian production and use of salt. And when in 1977, I had the good fortune of working I was just finishing my doctorate at Brown University, and I got a job with Harvard University with the Lower Mississippi Survey, where I had been as an undergraduate. And there was a project going on Avery Island, which is on the coast of Louisiana. And Avery Island is not an island in the way that we think of it, being out in the middle of the ocean or anything, but it's a salt dome. And why it was important, it was only 2 miles in diameter. It wasn't a very large island. But why it was important, it had the only active salt spring in the southeastern United States. And we knew that there was an important site there. And so I can still remember going out there in 1977, and the person who was the vice president of the McLaney Company, which you might not know McLaney Company, but you probably have heard of Tabasco sauce.
Yes.
And that's the ones that produced it. But he took me out to the salt spring and he said, Ian, this is the kind of stuff that we find around here. And he started pointing out things. And I looked over and there was a giant pile of tiles. They looked like roof tiles to me. And I started laughing, and then I realized they were all pots. They were broken pots, Indian pots. And I realized right then and there that I had never seen so much pottery in my life all together in one spot, and thought I could spend the rest of my life studying that pile of pottery. And that was my first impression of just how rich these production sites are. Now, what I had read of salt production in the past among the Eastern American Indians was that they had these large, thick vessels, presumably that they put the brine in it and added rocks and stuff like that to bring it out of solution. At least that's what people were thinking. This pottery wasn't at all like that. this pottery was very, very thin, and they were bowls only about this size. But there were thousands and thousands of them, and I did excavations there and all. It was not like any other kind of salt production site that I knew of in terms of the literature. And so what I needed to do, and this book right here is what developed out of my search. It's Salt in the Eastern North American Indian, and it was published by the Lower Mississippi Survey of Peabody Museum, Harvard in 1980. But what I ended up doing in this work was to try and recover everything that was written about salt production among the Eastern American Indians to see if there was anything similar to what I was finding on Avery Island. And there were hints of it, but not a great amount. But also it showed that we didn't really understand the evolution of this type of pottery that was being used to make salt, and we didn't really know how important it was to the Indians themselves, and when it became important. So I was trying to figure out from all these sites what was the chronology, what was the context of usage of and the production. And again, there was nothing quite similar to what I was finding on Avery Island, so I went further afield then and started looking at the rest of the world. And there wasn't a great amount to look at that time. There was Ream's thesis, the Colchester volume that was written, the Quai de Brisay volume, which she had brought together people from different parts of Europe, primarily Africa, Japan. And when I started reading that volume, I was seeing analogies with what I had at Avery Island. And I was thinking then maybe they had figured out an evolution in the technology in North America that they had already figured out in the rest of the world at earlier times. And so I started, the last section of this book was then looking at the world scene and seeing if I could find parallels for salt productions in the United States, so that I could make a prediction of what could be found if we went back and we investigated these other sites. And interesting, at the same time that I was doing this, a person that I had gone to through college with, Tony Andrews, was doing the same thing for his dissertation work. He was looking at Mayan salt production and wrote a book on that. And we were both found out that we were doing these things independently. He had a lot more data than I had, but we were both looking at the salt experience anew because it had been undervalued in the Americas, very much so. And then through time, with Dr. Dumas, she got involved. Actually, she had worked in southeastern Alabama on late woodland Indian sites. I knew her expertise on that work in that area. And she also, when she came to study with me here, she wrote her master's thesis on work in over on Avery Island, working on the original Tabasco factory plant. So, when she decided that she was going to come here to do her doctorate, I said, well, why don't we take your expertise that you have on Indian ceramics materials from Alabama and look at the issue of salt, because the situation in southwest Alabama is very, very different from Avery Island. And there's more of an evolution that you can see from these very thick, large pans to the small, thinner ones, and there's ones that are basket impressed. And I had done an earlier survey on the Clark County salines, and in this book we get into some detail on the two sites that she investigated in great more detail in her own dissertation. And so she went back and did further studies and made a major contribution with her doctorate. In the meantime, too, I started teaching my course in the Anthropology of Salt And it's gone under different names too. It was Salt and Civilization, I call it. But I taught it as a seminar in a special program that we had for undergraduates at the university called the Undergraduate Initiative, the Blunt Undergraduate Initiative. And it had a success of sorts. I would use these case studies from different parts of the world. And at one point, I was using the Colchester volume and telling the students about the red hills of southeastern England. And they said, well, what do they look like? I said, well, they're red. And they said, yeah, but, describe it. I mean, how do they feel? I said, well, I don't know. I've never been there. So I decided that the next summer I was going to do a field trip. And so I went to England, and I made contact with Paul Seeley, who was a curator at the Colchester Museum, and arranged to see collections there. I plotted out where all the sites were that I wanted to see and the things, and I figured I didn't really think that I could contribute much to this because I was going mostly as a sightseer. But when I actually saw the collections that were in the museum, and I went through every box of every collection, and they were not matching with what I had read about them. There were things, I was seeing different things in them. I was seeing different orientations of the vessel. I was seeing ways in which some of the vessels clearly had been spliced together in unique fashions that weren't making sense why they were. There were other forms of briquetage, like these pedestals, coming from the same context, and some of them had different tempering, yet they were found clearly in the same furnace. And so as a result of seeing all these materials and seeing the sites, in this volume, it's one of those kind of things where you have a Eureka moment, and this volume deals with this whole story of me coming to terms with a collection there and discussing it then, my findings with Dr. Seeley, and he too was realizing I was seeing some things that they hadn't seen before. And so I decided I needed to write these up. And what you saw in the volume with the China volume that Dr. Lothar von Falkenson had put together, that deals with that study in an abbreviated form. And then a few years later, I decided to travel throughout England, and by canal boat this time, because that's how the salt traveled throughout England on the Cheshire area. So I wanted that experience of doing it. And again, both of these books are my journals, and I mix in there too a lot of archaeology and other aspects of it. But it's my journal, and part of it is the excitement of the discovery. And so there's lots more than just salt in it. And then the thing on Avery Island, this volume just came out this year, but this is the final production of all the work that we did on Avery Island. It's not just salt, but the majority of the story is salt and the role that it played in the Indian population in that area. And this is the result of decades of research. And you can see why I'm not giving it to you to go on the plane. Did you feel it? But if you would like, I will mail you it. It's very, very heavy paper, because there is a lot of illustrations of it. But that has, from what we know about how the Indians of Avery Island, in a very, very tight component, the assemblage of pottery that they used and how they were making it is reconstructed to the best of my knowledge in that book. So one thing about Avery Island too, it was very, very clear that the people that had come to the island to produce salt, there were two different populations. One was a population that had stemmed out of the early peoples that were there, when they started to have an agricultural base, they started to make salt because they needed it for their diet. And they made salt differently from a later component where people had come in with that very, very thin pottery, and they had clearly come in from an area at least 400 or 500 miles away. So the question became, why there? There were other salt springs closer that they could have gone to. And this then gets into the whole issue of who controlled these things. So there's politics, social issues, economic issues, and the like. So I knew that there were other salt springs in Louisiana, in the northwestern part of the state, that we knew historically were being used heavily. And there was even evidence of Indian pottery at a number of them. And so when Paul Eubanks came along and expressed an interest in continuing the story, I said, well, this is a place we don't know much about. This is Drake's Lake, which he was talking about yesterday. And so he has spent the last 4 or 5 years excavating over numerous seasons the salt springs in that area to present that part of the story. And it's pretty clear that in that area they started to be used heavily when the French went into the area, and that prior to that there must not have been quite the same need. And I think part of it has to do with the area to the west of that was in Texas, more hunting-gathering populations, less agriculture, didn't have the need to be using the salt springs. And when the French came in, there was the need, but who the people on Avery Island were catering to, because it's an earlier period, that's part of the question, the interesting social political dynamics that I'd like to know more about. So I don't know if I'll be around long enough to have more students or long enough to do it myself, but I keep coming back to the salt story my entire life. And it's an exciting part of the story because it has involved all of us, all countries. And again, you're right, if it's not salt and they have no knowledge of it, well, they're not civilized. So that's about it.
Well, thank you for this fascinating interview, and we are looking forward to share it with our colleagues from Romania who are interested in salt. And also, if you agree, we would very much like to put it online on our website.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd be happy to. That'd be fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't think I said anything.